podcast. Today we continue our discussion on the contemporary meets the classic. This is part 11. This is a roundtable discussion between Imam Warthuddin Mohammed, Ibn Al-Razi, and Ibn Kathir on the Tafseer of Al-Faatihah. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. والصلاة والسلام على رسوله الكريم محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين أما بعد. That is, all praise is due to Allah, the guardian evolver, cherisher, sustainer of all the systems of knowledge. We witness that nothing deserves worship except Allah, and we witness that Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam is Allah's servant and his messenger. Again, we want to thank you for joining us on the Imam's Corner podcast. This is part 11 of an ongoing discussion of the Tafseer of Al-Faatihah, referencing the works of the late, great, preeminent American scholar, Imam Warthuddin Muhammad, Ibn Kathir, and we added not too long ago, we added Al-Razi to this discussion too, who's another venerable, respected scholar. And it's been going well. We're 11 parts in, and we were recently discussing. We started out with Imam Mohammed rahimahullah alayhi and Al-Razi, and then we added Ibn Kathir. And so now we're getting more into the commentary of Ibn Kathir, and we discussed what Ibn Kathir said about the isti'adha, and we talked about a'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. That's where we are, and we were discussing kind of the commentary of this by Ibn Kathir, and we want to talk about the meaning of rajim, or rajma. We know one of the translations is to be stoned, and Ibn Kathir mentions rajim means to be expelled from all types of righteousness. And then in typical Ibn Kathir pattern, he begins to go through the different ayah in the Quran that references the shaitan as being rejected. And one is in Surah 67, ayah 5. Another one is 37, ayah 6 through 10. And then another one is sort of 15, ayah 16 through 18. And then he goes on and further he says, Ar-Rajim means a person who throws or bombard things, because the devil throws doubts and evil thoughts into a person's heart. The first meaning is more popular and accurate. Now, in helping you and I process this, stones, we stone the devil on Hajj. That's one of the rites on Hajj. So Rajim, right? Shaitan, the rejected one. And just being a student of Imam Warthuddin Muhammad and having a grasp of how he would approach and address things, one thing that I could in looking at this and looking at the tools that he gave us, remember in an earlier tafsir, not tafsir, but in an earlier session, mentioned something Imam Muhammad rahimahullah alayhi told us at a Ramadan session. May Allah have mercy on him. And some of you who may not have listened to all the previous 10 portions of this presentation, you may not have heard when I mentioned this, but Imam Muhammad was mentioning how people would tell him, "We thank you, brother Imam, for bringing us to the Quran and the Sunnah." And Imam Muhammad went on to say, "Is that all that I brought you?" Now, I want to pause right there because sometimes if you hear these things and you're looking for, and your intention is to criticize, you'll hear things like that. And the first things that will come to your mind is something critical. But I want you just to open up your mind for a second and hear the rest of it. Um, After Imam Muhammad rahimahullah alayhi said this, and remember, in the first two videos, probably, or the first two parts of this Imam's Corner podcast, we spent time talking about context and the context for Imam Warithuddin Muhammad. And Imam Muhammad was talking to a group of his supporters and followers and his students, a large group of his students. Most of them had come from the Nation of Islam and those experiences in the Nation of Islam. So when you hear what the Imam said in that context, it's going to make it much easier for you to process it and understand it. Having the proper, I'll say the proper regard for it, and uh, understanding the importance of context. So then he said, I also brought you tools that no one else before me brought you to help you get to the Quran and the Sunnah. So it's one thing to, and he goes on to talk about how many people had the Quran and the life example of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, uh, and made some references to the progress that people were making. As I was listening to it as a young man at the Ramadan session, he was how I interpreted what he was saying was that the thought processes and the logic and the definitions and the way to approach the Quran was tools that he gave us, meaning those who were his students and his followers, and no one else that had come and engaged them had given us such tools. So these tools form a process of thinking in you, and then once the process of thinking is formed in you, you begin to see everything through those tools. So when Imam Muhammad would say something like hikmah or wisdom means the rules of logic, that means the rules of logic. And then he will go on and he will say everything is supported by a logic. And he would say things like Hakim means wise judge, but to be a judge means you understand the rules of logic behind a thing. And those rules of logic allow you to make a decision about a thing based on those rules of logic. Now, for those of you who've been listening to this series, you've heard me say that before, but now I want to place that in context of these tools that Imam Muhammad gave us as to understand the Quran and Sunnah as we go into them. So then, as someone reading this in the context of the tools that Imam Muhammad rahimahullah alayhi gave us, when I see something like rajim and I see something like curse, and then I think about the stoning of the devil, the first thing that comes to my mind is an understanding of stoning as, or stones as principles, as stones represent principles. So when you're stoning the devil, it's principles that you stone the devil with. It's a principles that you stone the devil with and that you govern your life by. Is these principles that become extremely important for you and I in terms of how we gear our life and lead our life to avoid the influences of the devil or the shaitan. So let's move on now. We've studied a whole lot, and I think there's some value in this discussion and this reflection. I hope that you have been enjoying this discussion, and we're going to get to the Ibn Kathir's explanation of of Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, as we have done with Al-Razi's explanation of Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, and Imam Mohammed Rahim al-Alayh, his explanation of Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. What I would like to do, I would like to take a second and look at some of the grammar of Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim as a reminder, to everyone that's listening, because this is since this is part 11, a lot of this stuff, a lot of these things we talked about earlier. And so, since this is an ongoing discussion, there's some value in going back and looking at things, um, and just reviewing them and understanding um, them. So when we look at Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, there is there's a grammatical analysis of Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim that we should keep in mind when we're doing this. The way that Imam Qasim Ahmed Rahim al-Ali, may Allah forgive him his sins and bless him with paradise, who was one of the top students of Imam Warithuddin Muhammad, who was also one of the most prolific teachers of the Quran in the United States of America. And I would say the history of the United States of America, and one of the first major teachers of the Quran and Arabic to the indigenous Muslim population. So Imam Qasim Rahim al-Ali, when he was explaining grammar to us, he was telling us that grammar are the rules and the laws of language. And then, using those same tools that I spoke about earlier, he reminded us where Imam Muhammad Rahim al-Ali said, words make people, and that uh, we are an embodiment of words. And when asked, what is a word is anything that comes to your mind by way of your five senses. He will spend a long time talking about the importance of words. So Imam Qasim, in talking about language and grammar and how we think with words, how we have to think with word, and he would always make a very funny joke when he said, try to think without using a word. So following that path, he related grammar to being rules of language, and then therefore rules of thinking. That if our thinking is based on language and words, and grammar is the law for words, then there's an influence that grammar has on our thinking. So that being said, I want to take a second just to look at the grammar of Al-Faatihah. And if you go under corpusquran.com, called the Quranic Arabic Corpus, and I've shared this website with you many a times, and that's where I'm taking this information from. You see a whole bunch of different tabs, okay? And one of those tabs is called grammar. And there's a whole discussion of grammar, Quranic grammar under there. But then under an ayah, you can click on what's called the syntactic tree book. And under there, you're going to see the syntax of the grammar. Okay. And so then you can click on each word. And when you click on the word, you'll see the grammar that's attached to it. So when you see Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, here you're going to see a preposition. That Bismillah begins with a preposition, and when we discussed this originally, and this is not necessarily from the Tafseer of Ibn Kathir, Al-Razi, our Imam Warathuddin Mohammed. There was a discussion that I had with Imam Qasim Ahmed, and he was talking about, is Bismillah a verbal or a nominal sentence? And I talked about some of this in Al-Razi, actually. Al-Razi, when we were discussing Al-Razi, we mentioned his kind of discussion on, is Bismillah a verbal or nominal sentence? So that's not really what we're talking about today. We're just looking at um, the parts of grammar that's in Bismillah. So Bismillah begins with a prepositional phrase. Now, I think it's important to note that even in the Corpus Quran, they have under Bismillah, they have an asterisk with a V uh, word before the preposition, and it's muta'alaqa. So even they get into the grammar of it, and even they talk about, and they, in their notations, as I'm reading this, there's a reference to uh, the implicit, or what the understood way Al-Faatihah starts. So just so that we're aware of this discussion of a perception that although Al-Faatihah begins with a noun, there's an implicit, it's implicit that it's a verbal sentence, or it begins with a preposition, right? So you have Bismillah. And the B is a preposition, which means, and we did a long talk about this. We did within, we talked about Imam W.D. Muhammad's commentary and his interpretation and understanding of the word be, and what it is and how to process it. But Bismillah. So you have the preposition, and then you have uh, the noun that's drugged under the influence of the preposition. So jarra wa majrur. So you have the preposition and then the noun drug under the influence of the preposition, and that's called ism majruru bil kasra. That when you begin a when you place a preposition before a noun, the noun that's following it gets a kasra. So now, linguistically, the word um, the root for the word ism is samawa, samia, samawa, and it means to name her. So, like where Allah says in the Quran, "Wa inni samaytuha Maryam," and certainly I have named her Maryam. And then this is mentioned 318 times in the Quran, and it's mentioned as a verb and as a noun, and then it's mentioned in different ways of being a noun, and it's also mentioned as the passive participle. And so all this is under Corpus Quran when you click on it. And so then in a typical sentence, uh, you have two parts of that sentence. You have a nominal in a typical nominal sentence. You have two parts. You have um, the mubtada wa khabar. Okay. Um, but before that, you have mudafu ilay. Mudafu ilay. And the mudaf ilay is the genitive or construct phrase. That's how Imam Qasim taught it to us. So when you say Bismillah, Bismi is the mudaf, and Allah is the ilay. And in mudaf ilay, the first noun is dominated, owned, or possessed by the second noun. So in this case, Allah dominates, owns, or possesses Bismi. And the kasra shows ownership. And typically, grammatically in mudaf ilay, the first noun will end in dhamma and the second noun will end in kesra. So if there was no bismi here, if there was no ba as a preposition, and this was just ismu, this would say ismullahi, like Baytullahi, Masjidullahi. So we would say this ismullahi. But since there's the preposition be preceding it, the noun ism or not ism but yes, ism is name, but the noun then the preposition replaces what you would typically see in the you would see a fatha there when you're referring to someone's name in this way, but in this instance, because it begins with the preposition, the bismi ends in kasra, not damma. So you say Bismillah. So Bismi is the mudaf, Allah is the ilay. And then after that comes adjectives. The adjectives give information about the noun. So in this case, the adjectives give grammatically. So if you notice here in this chart here, it says it's indicated by P N. So let's go back. So we start with P, which is a prefix preposition B. Then we go to N, which means a genitive masculine noun, jara wa majrur. And then PN in Corpus Quran stands for proper noun, Allah. Okay. So Bismillah here, jara wa majrur, with Allah's name. Then comes the adjective. Adjective, then genitive, masculine, singular attribute, and it's sifat majrura. Sifat majrura. So ar-Rahman and ar-Rahim are both adjectives. And if you make a note of here grammatically, in the chart, it's going to show you that it's an adjective here, sifat, and then both of these are sifat, and they're adjectives. And those adjectives, if you notice the arrows underneath the purple lines, the arrows underneath the purple lines shows you what these adjectives are describing. And then you see the pronoun Allah, and there's an arrow going back to this mudaf ilay, just connecting them to, so they're all connected. So you say Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Bismi then is jarra wa majrur, that is the preposition and the genitive noun. Allah then is the proper noun, and it takes a kesra because of that. And then ar-Rahman ar-Rahim uh, uh, are adjectives that are describing Allah. We could take Allah and make this separate. And we could, if we took Bismi away, we could say Allahu Rahmanur Rahim. That Allah is the merciful benefactor and the merciful redeemer. And so then Allah then is the mubtada, and Ar-Rahman Rahim is the khabar. In a nominal, typically in a nominal sentence, you have two parts. You have a mubtada and a khabar. The mubtada is the subject, and the khabar provides information about the subject. So if we could take Allah, we could take that when we could say Allahu Rahman Rahim, and that would be an example of a nominative sentence. So you put it all together, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. So take some time, go back through, look at the grammar, process the grammar, understand the grammar, because a large part of understanding the Quran, processing and reading the Quran, is understanding the grammar of the Quran. So now I want to get into Ibn Kathir's discussion on Bismillah. And I want to end today on the idea of saying Bismillah before you do any deed. And we go back to Imam Muhammad's interpretation of Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, and him interpreting it to mean with Allah's name, the merciful benefactor, the merciful redeemer. And see that in the context. So we're putting them in conversation. And as I understand it, that I learned from my teachers, Imam Qasim Ahmed, that Imam Mohammed Rahman alayhi said we should begin all major functions with Al-Faatihah. And if we begin all major functions with Al-Faatihah, we will begin with Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. So Ibn Kathir says the Bismillah is recommended before one starts any action. And then he gives example before one enters a place, when one wants to relieve himself, before eating, all these things. So Bismillah is very powerful. We have run out of time today. So we thank you for joining us on part 10, part 11. Part 12 will be during the beautiful month of Ramadan. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. And also, we'll be doing a daily, very short, it won't be 30 minutes. We'll do a daily podcast on the different themes during the month of Ramadan. The first 10 days, we'll do an ayah that has some reference to mercy. In the second 10 days, we'll give some ayah that has to do with forgiveness. And then the last 10 days, we will speak of on ayah that talk about us being protected from the punishment of the fire. So alhamdulillah, thank you for joining us today. May Allah bless you and your families. Assalamu alaikum.